Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Christmas at the Carter house had always been a performance, a full-blown production that teetered between Hallmark sentimentality and silent, icy tension, depending on how much Jim Carter had been drinking before dinner. This year, the show was running late because my brother Mike's kids were screaming over who got the bigger present. My mother was trying to pass off store-bought rolls as homemade, and my father was about 2 glasses deep into his favorite cheap whiskey, which meant things were about to get festive in a whole different way. I sat at the far end of the massive oak table, the one he had proudly refinished the year my mother threatened to leave him, fiddling with the silverware and wishing I could fast forward through the next 2 hours of family tradition. The room smelled like turkey, burned cranberry sauce, and cigarette smoke soaked deep into the curtains from the 70s. Someone had set the Christmas lights to blink in that fast, seizure-inducing pattern that made me feel like I was being interrogated instead of celebrated. My cousins were gossiping, my aunts were gossiping louder, and Uncle Rick was already asleep in the recliner, snoring like a chainsaw against the soft tones of some holiday special playing in the background. My mother kept shooting nervous glances at my father, silently begging him not to make a scene tonight, not to ruin one more holiday with one more outburst nobody would talk about later. But if there was one thing my father loved more than cheap whiskey, it was a good, public execution. He tapped his knife against his wine glass, an old crystal thing passed down from my grandmother, already chipped at the rim, and the clinking sound somehow cut through the noise like a fire alarm. Everyone stopped. Even the kids dropped their new toys, sensing the shift in the air like dogs before a storm. I swallowed hard, already knowing that whatever he was about to say wasn't going to end in applause. He stood, his gut straining against his plaid shirt, his cheeks flushed red from the heat and the booze. Family, he slurred just slightly, lifting his glass in some half-assed toast. We're lucky, ain't we? Got the Carter name. Built something real in this town. Built it from dirt, from nothing. His eyes found mine across the table like laser sights. Except some of us, he added, letting the words hang there like a noose. The silence in the room thickened into something you could almost bite through. My brother shifted uncomfortably, pretending to be fascinated by a gravy stain on the tablecloth. My mother gripped her wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. It had been the third Christmas in a row I'd messed up. Or maybe fourth. That's not my strong suit, especially after 2 glasses of wine. I sat perfectly still, willing myself not to react, not to give him the satisfaction. He smirked, sensing my restraint, and drove the knife deeper. Some people, he continued, voice rising, think they're too good for honest work. Think they're better than roofing, better than running a real business. He laughed, but it was the ugliest sound I ever heard come out of a human being. Spent our hard-earned money on fancy college degrees and art crap. Coulda had a future, coulda been somebody. Instead, you're a disappointment. To me. To this family. He dropped back into his chair with a heavy thud, looking pleased with himself like a man who just delivered the closing argument in a murder trial and knew had won. I felt every pair of eyes at that table swing towards me, waiting for me to cry or shout or storm out. But I just smiled. That small, tight, polite smile you save for strangers who bump into you at the grocery store and don't apologize. Inside, though, it felt like something cracked. Not snapped. Cracked. Like the first time you notice a tiny hairline fracture in your windshield after a rock hits it, small at first, almost invisible, but you know it's only a matter of time before the whole thing shatters. I pushed my chair back quietly, the wooden legs scraping against the old tile floor, and stood. My mother made a tiny, helpless noise in her throat. My father leaned back in his chair like a king surveying the battlefield. Nobody said a word. Nobody asked me to stay. I didn't bother looking at any of them. I just picked up my coat from the back of the chair, slipped it on, and walked to the front door. Outside, the air hit my face sharp and cold, smelling of frost and chimney smoke. Christmas lights blinked stupidly from every house on the block, wreaths sagged from mailboxes, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked like it, too, was tired of pretending everything was fine. I got into my beat-up old Corolla and sat for a moment, staring at the dashboard, the weight of the evening pressing down so hard I thought it might crush me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even curse. I just sat there, hands on the wheel, feeling the slow, cold realization that this wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't just tonight. It was every little moment that had led here, every eye roll, every sarcastic comment, every little joke about how sensitive I was, how ungrateful I had turned out to be. I started the engine, the car coughing awake like an old smoker, and pulled away from the curb without looking back at the house where I had grown up. The house where I had been crown family failure tonight in front of everybody who was supposed to love me unconditionally. Something inside me had changed during that dinner. It wasn't rage. It wasn't sorrow. It was something colder, something harder, something more final. And the thing about cracks is, they only ever get bigger. That night, under the flickering Christmas lights and the cheap tinsel decorations and the heavy stink of judgment, a part of me closed the door on that house and on him forever. Though at the time, I didn't know I'd get the perfect chance to close another door too. And when it came, I didn't just walk through it. I slammed it so damn hard, the whole house shook. But that part of the story was still waiting just a few months down the road. New Year's Eve used to mean something in our family, used to mean too much tinsel and too many leftover turkey sandwiches and my father falling asleep in the recliner with a paper plate balanced on his gut, snoring loud enough to shake the walls. But this year, the house was silent because I wasn't invited, and even if I had been, there was not a bone in my body that would have dragged me back through that door after Christmas night. I spent the evening alone in my tiny apartment above a laundromat, listening to the distant thuds of fireworks set off by teenagers who had nothing better to do and flipping through the same 5 channels on my ancient television set, none of which could make the loneliness clawing at my chest feel any less sharp. The family group chat, which had once buzzed with photos of bad casseroles and drunken toasts, lit up my phone every few minutes with updates about my brother Mike's kids singing off-key into a karaoke machine, or Uncle Rick passing out in a Santa hat, or my mother's pies being even better this year somehow. Not one message was meant for me, not even a polite Happy New Year, and the thing about being left out is that it stops hurting after a while, but it never really stops aching. I muted the chat, shoved the phone under a couch cushion, and stared out the window at the frost crawling across the glass, thinking about how easy it is for people to pretend you never existed when it makes their lives simpler. It had not always been this way. Not exactly, though if I was being honest with myself, and I had nothing but time and brutal honesty these days, it had been coming for a long time. My father's disappointment in me wasn't some sudden thunderclap. It had been building for years, brick by bitter brick, ever since I turned 18 and sat across from him at the kitchen table, telling him I had no interest in taking over Carter Roofing and Repairs, no interest in following him up ladders and hammering shingles under the baking sun. He had stared at me like I had grown a second head, like I was speaking a language he didn't understand, and maybe I was, because to him, hard labor was the only honest way to live, and anything else was just playing pretend. I told him I wanted to go to art school, that I wanted to paint and draw and make something beautiful instead of patching other people's leaking roofs, and he laughed, an ugly bark that made my cheeks burn with humiliation even as I fought to keep my voice steady. "Painting's not a job," he said, stabbing a thick finger into the table for emphasis. "It's what kids do before they grow the hell up." But I didn't back down. I applied to a state university 3 towns over, got a partial scholarship, and packed my things into the back of my beat-up car, leaving behind the safety net of family for a dream my father had already decided was worthless. For years later, diploma in hand, I came back home to save money, juggling waitressing and freelancing as an illustrator for whoever would pay me. I knew he thought I would fail, thought I would come crawling back for a job with the company, but I didn't. I started building a client list, working late into the night designing logos and wedding invitations and book covers for small authors no one had ever heard of, each paycheck barely enough to cover rent and ramen noodles, but enough to keep me going. Slowly, painfully, I began to carve out something that was mine, something nobody could take away by calling it foolish or childish. Still, every time I drove past one of Carter Roofing's signs plastered to a chain-link fence or saw my father's truck rumbling down Main Street, I felt that old pang of guilt and sadness twisting inside me, like maybe I had betrayed something, even if that something had never really made room for me to begin with. The nights were the worst, lying awake and wondering if I had made the wrong choices, if there had been a way to make both dreams fit into the same life. But the truth was, my father only ever had room for one kind of success. The kind you could nail down and measure in calluses and bruises, and anything else was a disappointment by default. Weeks after Christmas blurred into a bitter January, snow piling up in dirty drifts along the sidewalks, and I settled into a kind of grim routine, working, eating alone. Ignoring the occasional accidental text from my mother meant to remind me what I was missing. The hurt dulled a little each day, replaced by a thin layer of resentment that I told myself wasn't healthy but clung to anyway, because it kept me warm. It was late one night, flipping through old sketchbooks and trying not to think about how silent my phone had been for the last 31 days, when a message finally buzzed its way through the static. It was from an old high school friend I hadn't spoken to in years, a guy who had stayed in town, worked odd jobs, and kept tabs on local gossip the way some people hoard lottery tickets. "Hey," the message said. "Heard your dad's company is in some deep shit. Big lawsuit or something. Just thought you'd want to know." I stared at the screen, heart pounding in my chest so loudly I thought maybe the neighbors could hear it too, because somewhere deep down, under all the anger and bitterness, there was a part of me that had never stopped waiting for this moment. The inevitable collapse of the pedestal my father had built for himself out of stubbornness and pride. I turned off the lamp, lay back on the couch in the dark, and closed my eyes, feeling a smile pull at my lips for the first time in weeks. I hadn't burned the bridge after all. He had. And now maybe, just maybe, it was time to start rebuilding on my own damn terms. 3 months after that bitter Christmas night, spring was trying its best to claw its way into our little town, though the stubborn patches of dirty snow still clung to the sidewalks like bruises that refused to fade, and it was during those wet, gray days that the cracks in my father's empire finally spread wide enough for the whole damn town to see. Carter Roofing and Repairs, the family name my father had slapped on every pickup truck and billboard for 20 straight years, was now circling the drain faster than he could plug the leaks. And it wasn't because of the economy or bad luck or the so-called lazy younger generation he loved to blame for everything from potholes to rising gas prices. It was because Jim Carter, in all his arrogance, had decided he didn't need to carry insurance for his crew anymore, figuring it was a waste of money when you only hired good men who knew how to stay on their feet. Except good men sometimes fall, and when one of his workers did, right off a 2-story roof and into months of surgeries and physical therapy. There wasn't a damn thing backing my father up except empty promises and the kind of blind faith that a handshake deal was still worth anything in a world built on contracts and fine print. The lawsuit hit like a hammer, first stripping his business accounts dry, then bleeding into personal savings, until finally, inevitably, the bank came calling for the house he'd mortgaged to cover his legal fees. The house I had once called home, the same house where I had painted my first mural on my bedroom wall at 12 years old, the same house where my father had stood tall and smug and told me, in front of everyone, that I was nothing but a shame to the Carter name. That house was about to be yanked out from under him like a dirty rug. The irony tasted so sweet I could have bottled it and sold it like perfume. Word traveled fast in towns like ours, faster than wildfire, faster than common sense. My brother Mike heard it first, of course, because he was always hanging around the town bar, and he passed it on to my mother in hushed, frantic tones, who in turn called everyone she knew, spinning the story in a way that made my father sound more like a victim of cruel fate than the author of his own downfall. Still, sympathy only stretches so far when people have their own mortgages and medical bills to worry about, and one by one, the family members he had always favored, cousins, siblings, even Mike himself, turned him down when he came knocking for help. Too risky, they said. Too much debt. Too much history they didn't want to tangle with. I wasn't supposed to know any of this, of course. In their minds, I was still that soft, sensitive girl who had abandoned the family for paintbrushes and foolish dreams, someone too weak or too proud to be part of the real world they lived in. But pride is a funny thing, fragile as a spider's web and just as easy to tear apart when you're desperate enough, and so it came to pass that on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while I was hunched over my desk sketching a logo for a local bakery, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months. Dad. Just that. No "hey, it's me." No apology text paving the way. No heads up from my mother or Mike. Just Dad flashing on the screen like a ghost from a life I had almost finished burying. For a second, I let it ring, heart hammering in my chest, caught between the old instinct to answer immediately, to be the good daughter, the obedient little girl he could mold into whatever shape suited him, and the newer, harder edge that had been sharpening inside me ever since I walked out of that Christmas dinner without looking back. I answered, finally, because some part of me needed to hear it, needed to hear the crack in his voice, needed the proof that even the strongest walls can crumble when you chip away long enough. "Emily," he said, and there it was, the tiniest hitch in his voice, so small most people would have missed it, but I caught it clear as day, because when you've spent your whole life trying to make someone proud, you learn to hear every crack, every slip, every weakness they try to hide. "I need your help," he said, and the words tasted like vinegar coming out of his mouth. You could tell. He explained, or tried to, stumbling over details he would have once laid out like blueprints, the lawsuit, the debt, the foreclosure notice pinned to the front door like a scarlet letter. He needed someone to co-sign a loan, someone with halfway decent credit and no bankruptcy filings hanging over their head like an executioner's axe. He needed me. I listened in silence, swirling a pencil between my fingers, feeling every petty, human instinct surge up inside me like a tidal wave. The part of me that remembered every cutting remark, every sneer, every Christmas where I was the invisible girl at the table, she wanted to laugh right in his face. But the older, smarter part of me, the part that had learned how to survive on her own, knew that laughter was too cheap, too easy. No, I wanted something better. I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch long enough that he had to squirm on the other end of the line, and then I said, "Meet me at the bank. We'll talk there." The relief in his voice was instant, almost pathetic, like a man offered a lifeline he didn't deserve, and it would have been so easy to end it right there, to cut him off like he had once cut me. But I had waited a long time for this, and I wanted to watch the fall happen with my own eyes. The bank smelled like disinfectant and cold metal, the kind of place where hope came to be weighed, measured, and often found lacking, and as I stepped through the heavy glass doors into the sterile lobby, I couldn't help but feel like I was walking into a funeral, except nobody had bothered to bring flowers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a dull, miserable hum, and the gray industrial carpet sucked the life out of every footstep like it had been designed specifically to drain the last bit of color out of people's dreams. I spotted him right away, slumped into a chair by a fake ficus plant that was shedding plastic leaves like a sick tree, and for a second, I almost didn't recognize him. Jim Carter, who had once been larger than life, filling up every room he entered with his booming voice and brash confidence, now looked like a worn-out version of himself, his shoulders hunched, his once proud gut sagging under a threadbare jacket that had probably fit him better when life had, too. He stood up when he saw me, but not all the way, as if the weight of everything he had lost, or maybe just the weight of his own stubborn pride, kept him pinned halfway to the ground. His eyes flicked over me quickly, assessing, calculating, and maybe even hoping he could find some crack of forgiveness or softness to exploit. the way he always had when words alone failed him. I gave him nothing but a nod, tight and professional, the kind you would offer to a stranger you were doing business with for the first and hopefully last time. A woman in a stiff navy blazer called us into her office, her nameplate reading Susan K., Senior Loan Officer, and we followed her like schoolchildren summoned to the principal's office, my father dragging his feet so slightly I wondered if he even noticed. Susan motioned for us to sit, flipping through a stack of papers so thick it looked like it could crush a lesser man's spirit, and when she finally looked up at us, she wore the kind of smile that people use when delivering bad news, softened by the thinnest layer of corporate sympathy. So she began, her voice brisk but not unkind. "Mr. Carter, as we discussed on the phone, given your current financial situation and outstanding liabilities, the bank cannot extend further credit to you as an individual borrower without additional security or a qualified co-signer." She turned to me, her eyes bright with rehearsed professionalism. "That would be you, Miss Carter." The word qualified hung between us like a judgment. She slid a crisp packet of papers across the desk towards me, outlining the loan terms in neat black and white cruelty, the amount, the interest rates, the penalties if payments were missed, the total financial responsibility that would fall squarely on my shoulders should my father default. In simpler terms, if I signed, I wasn't just signing for him, I was signing away every piece of financial stability I had scraped and clawed for on my own, every dollar that represented nights spent hunched over freelance gigs no one else had believed in, every scrap of independence I had built from nothing while he had thrown his away on arrogance and negligence. I sat back in the stiff chair, feeling the hardness of it press into my spine, and stared at the papers without touching them. My father shifted nervously beside me, clearing his throat once, then again, his hands worrying at the edges of his jacket like a man trying to wring blood from an already dry stone. "You know," he said, voice rougher than I remembered, "it's not just for me. It's for your mother, too. For the house. For everything we built together." I almost laughed at the casual "we," as if my mother had ever been anything more than a background character in the saga of his cell-made kingdom, as if she had wanted that drafty old house or the broken dreams stuffed into its closets. Susan waited, polite but expectant, giving me time to consider, probably trained by years of seminars on customer retention and conflict management not to rush decisions that ruined people's lives. In my head, the battle raged louder than any argument we had ever had. One part of me, the part that still remembered Christmas mornings when my father would lift me onto his shoulders so I could put the angel on top of the tree, wanted to find a reason to forgive. To believe this was just a man who had made a few bad choices and deserved another chance. But the stronger part, the part forged in every cruel word and every cold shoulder, knew better. This wasn't just about a loan. This was about every time I had swallowed my hurt and smiled anyway, every time I had minimized my own pain, so I could stay part of a family that had never made room for me unless it was convenient. I leaned forward slowly, pressing my fingertips lightly against the stack of papers, enough to feel their sharp edges, but not enough to claim them, not enough to take ownership of the disaster that wasn't mine to fix. My father's breath caught, hope blooming in his eyes like weeds after rain, and for one tiny, dangerous second, I almost pitied him. Almost. Instead, I smiled warmly, the way you might smile at someone you were about to lie to or leave, and said no. The word wasn't shouted, wasn't spat out with the fury he might have expected. It was delivered softly, almost kindly, like the closing of a door or the final page of a long, tragic story. Susan blinked once, looking between us, but said nothing, her hands folding neatly on the desk as if she had seen this particular ending before. My father opened his mouth, but no words came out, just a small, strangled sound, part disbelief, part rage, part something too broken to name. I stood, smoothing the wrinkles from my coat, and looked down at him one last time, not with anger or triumph, but with something colder and more permanent, indifference. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the bank, the heavy glass doors sighing shut behind me, leaving him sitting there in that cold, sterile office, facing the ruins he had built with his own 2 hands. And, for the first time in my life, I felt lighter. Not happier. Not yet. But lighter. The second the bank doors clicked shut behind me, I could feel the pressure of the moment lifting off my chest, slow but sure, like taking off a soaked winter coat after being out in a storm too long. I didn't look back, not even when I heard my father's voice calling after me, first sharp with fury, then twisted with disbelief, and finally, bitterly pleading in a way I had never imagined I would hear from the man who once spoke like he was handing down commandments from a mountaintop. His words blurred into the hum of the busy street outside, lost among the honking cars and the biting March wind that whipped against my face, and for the first time in what felt like my entire life, I chose not to listen. I didn't go straight home after that meeting. Instead, I drove around town for a while, taking turns with no real destination in mind, letting the familiar streets wash over me like a language I had stopped speaking years ago. The Carter name still clung to places like stubborn graffiti, on the side of rusting work trucks, on cheap yard signs bowing in the mud, but already I could see it fading, the edges curling and peeling away, a reminder that nothing built on fear and pride lasts forever. It didn't take long for the news to travel, because in a town like ours, nothing ever stayed secret, especially not when it involved the fall of someone as loud and self-important as Jim Carter. By the end of that week, it seemed like everyone had picked a side, and as usual, they picked loudly. Half the family blamed me without hesitation, crowing that I had abandoned family values, that I was selfish and cruel and ungrateful for everything my father had given me, as if humiliation and emotional bruises were some kind of inheritance I should be proud to carry. The other half, the quieter half, sent furtive messages, subtle nods of approval that came wrapped in disclaimers, like they were afraid to be caught siding with the black sheep too openly. Cousin Teresa, who had married into the family and always kept a careful distance from the Carter brand of drama, left a voicemail saying, "Good for you, Em." About damn time someone stood up to him. A few old family friends who had watched Jim's arrogance from the sidelines for decades offered tight, knowing smiles when they saw me at the grocery store, small acknowledgments that sometimes the loudest men in town are the ones who deserve to fall the hardest. My mother called once, late at night, her voice so tight it was barely more than a whisper. She didn't yell or beg or curse me, just asked if I was sure, if maybe I could reconsider, if maybe there was a way to fix it. I listened, letting the hurt settle in my bones like a cold front, and when she finished, I simply said, "No, Mom. Not this time," and hung up before she could answer. The thing about guilt is, it sneaks up on you when you least expect it, showing up in the quiet moments, not in the chaos. It hit me hardest on Sunday mornings when I drove past the diner where my family used to have breakfast after church, seeing the empty parking spot where Dad's truck always used to sit. Or on the nights I caught myself doodling a roofline or a steeple in my sketch pad without thinking, old habits clinging to the corners of my mind like dust you can never fully clean out. Was I cruel? I asked myself that more times than I could count. Was turning my back on him when he was finally the one in need an act of cruelty or simple, cold fairness after years of being treated like an outsider at my own family table? Would it have been stronger to forgive, to rise above it all and play the good daughter even when it cost me everything I had built for myself? Or was strength sometimes measured not in kindness, but in knowing when enough was finally enough? There was no clear answer, and maybe there never would be. Some nights, I dreamed about that meeting in the bank, replaying it like an old movie reel, wondering what might have happened if I had said yes. If I had signed the papers and tied myself forever to the weight of a man who would never have lifted a burden for me if the roles were reversed. In the dreams, sometimes he smiled with gratitude, changed by my mercy, but more often, he laughed the way he did when I was a teenager, that bitter, biting laugh that stripped the skin right off your bones. I knew the truth in my gut even when my heart tried to lie to me. Mercy wouldn't have changed him. It would have only cost me. The bank eventually foreclosed on the house, of course. There was no last-minute miracle, no Hollywood redemption arc where the family rallied together to save the old homestead. It went up for auction one rainy Saturday morning, and the town barely blinked when the Carter house passed into the hands of strangers, who wasted no time painting over the flaking shutters and ripping out the overgrown rose bushes my mother once loved. I didn't go to watch the auction. I didn't drive by the house afterward, not even once. Some things, once burned, are better left in ashes. Mike moved his family 2 states over for a new job opportunity. Uncle Rick drank himself into another series of DUIs, and my mother eventually stopped calling, her silence heavier than any angry words could have ever been. As for me, I kept living day by day, small victories stacking up quietly, a new client here, a gallery exhibit there, a life rebuilt not out of obligation or expectation, but out of stubborn, defiant choice. I still think about that Christmas sometimes, the one where everything finally fell apart, but not with bitterness anymore. More like someone touching an old scar, remembering how it hurt once but no longer feeling the sting. I never missed another Christmas after that. Not once. I just spent them with people who wanted me at the table.